The fuel gauge was empty, not low, not blinking, empty. The needle sat on zero like it had given up on hope. The engine coughed. The road was silent. The night was watching. No gas station, no signal, no help, just darkness and disbelief, because the next thing that happened should not be possible. The car didn't stop. The engine didn't die. The dashboard didn't scream. Instead, the fuel needle moved, slow, deliberate, impossible, from empty to 1 bar, from 1 bar to half, from half to full. The fuel tank refilled on its own. No hose, no pump, no human touch. And that's where this story begins. Because when something that should never happen does happen, it means one of 3 things. You're hallucinating, you're being lied to, or reality is not what you think it is. This wasn't a dream, this wasn't a glitch, this wasn't a movie scene. This was real, documented, witnessed, and once you hear the full story, you will never look at empty the same way again. Think about it. Fuel is math, fuel is physics, fuel is rules. No fuel means no motion, no exceptions, no miracles, until this night, until this moment, until the tank said no. What if I told you this isn't the only time it's happened? What if I told you this has been reported quietly, globally, repeatedly? What if I told you engineers, mechanics, and scientists couldn't explain it? And what if the explanation is far more unsettling than a mechanical failure? Because this wasn't just fuel, it was timing, it was location, it was circumstance. The refill didn't happen earlier, it didn't happen later, it happened exactly when it was needed. Right before the engine died, right before panic took over, right before the driver stepped out into the dark, as if something or someone was watching the gauge, as if the system knew. Ask yourself this: how does an empty system create something from nothing? Gasoline doesn't appear, energy doesn't materialize, tanks don't lie, unless the rules have loopholes, unless the gauge isn't telling the whole truth, unless the tank was never empty to begin with, or worse, unless it was refilled without permission. This story forces a question nobody wants to ask. Can machines act on their own? Because if a fuel tank can refill itself, what else can systems do without us noticing? Your phone, your car, your power grid, your bank balance. We trust numbers, we trust indicators, we trust dashboards. But what if the numbers are only suggestions? What if the systems we depend on are smarter than we think? Or what if they're being helped? That night, the driver sat frozen, staring at the dashboard, hands shaking, heart racing, because relief came with fear. Running out of fuel is terrifying, but running out of explanations is worse. The engine purred like nothing happened. The road continued. The world stayed normal, too normal. And that's what made it terrifying, because miracles don't announce themselves. They slip in quietly. They leave no fingerprints, just questions. And the biggest question of all, who or what refilled the tank? Was it a sensor error, a delayed reading, a software reset, or was it something no manual covers? Because when mechanics checked the car later, they found something strange. No leaks, no damage, no evidence of refueling. The fuel was real, measured burn, which means it came from somewhere. And that's the part nobody can explain. This isn't a story about gas. This is a story about certainty collapsing, about realizing that empty doesn't always mean finished, that dead ends sometimes lie, that systems fail, but sometimes they intervene. And here's the part that changes everything. This didn't happen during comfort, it happened during desperation, right when quitting felt inevitable, right when stopping felt final, right when the journey was about to end. And that pattern repeats every single time, because maybe the tank isn't the story, maybe the moment is, maybe this wasn't about fuel, maybe it was about continuation, about something refusing to let the engine stop, about momentum being restored when all logic says it shouldn't. And if that's true, then this isn't just a mechanical mystery, it's a metaphor. Because how many times in life do we feel empty, out of energy, out of hope, out of options, and yet something pushes us forward, something refills us when we're done. No explanation, no warning, just motion. The fuel tank refilled on its own. And once you understand how, when, and why it happened, you'll realize this story isn't about a car at all. It's about what happens when empty isn't the end, and what happens next. Will change how you see limits forever. The road was supposed to be ordinary, predictable, forgettable, the kind of road you drive without remembering later. But that night, it felt like the road itself was holding its breath. The dashboard glowed softly, the engine hummed in a tired rhythm, and the fuel gauge sat on empty like a verdict that had already been delivered, because empty isn't a warning, it's a conclusion. It's the final sentence at the end of a journey, the point where motion is no longer allowed. Every mile felt borrowed, every second felt stolen, and the silence inside the car grew heavier with each passing moment, because when a machine keeps moving without fuel, your mind starts racing faster than the engine ever could, trying to explain something that refuses to make sense. The driver knew the rules. Everyone knows the rules. Cars don't run on hope. Engines don't burn optimism. And fuel doesn't magically appear just because you want it to. The needle doesn't lie. The numbers don't exaggerate. And when a tank hits zero, the story is supposed to end right there on the shoulder of the road, with hazard lights blinking like a public admission of failure. But that night, the ending didn't arrive on time, and when endings hesitate, something else is always happening beneath the surface. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a jolt or a noise or a warning light screaming for attention. It was subtle, almost polite, like reality asking permission before breaking its own rules. The needle twitched, not jumped, not reset. It moved the way a living thing moves when it wakes up, slowly, carefully, intentionally. And that tiny movement sent a shock through the driver's body, stronger than any breakdown ever could, because machines aren't supposed to hesitate and numbers aren't supposed to change their minds. At first, denial took over, because denial is safer than wonder. A sensor glitch, the driver thought, a delayed reading, maybe the slope of the road, maybe the gauge had been wrong the whole time. The mind will reach for any explanation that preserves normality, because once normality breaks, you're no longer in control. But the needle didn't stop. It kept rising, steady and calm, climbing past empty, past the warning zone, past logic itself, until it settled somewhere that shouldn't exist, somewhere comfortable, somewhere full. The engine never stuttered, the car never slowed, the road never changed, the world didn't react at all, and that was the most disturbing part. Because if something impossible happens and nobody reacts, you start wondering how many impossible things happen every day without anyone noticing. The driver stared at the dashboard longer than was safe, eyes flicking between the road the gauge, heart pounding, not from fear of stopping, but from fear of continuing, because continuing meant accepting that something had just happened that shouldn't have. When the next gas station finally appeared, glowing like a sanctuary in the distance, relief should have arrived, but it didn't. Instead, dread crept in, because answers are often more terrifying than problems. The car rolled to a stop, the engine cut, and the driver stepped out, half expecting the vehicle to collapse into pieces now that it had stopped pretending to be normal. But it didn't. It sat there quietly, patiently, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if the tank had always been full, as if the road had never been a threat. The pump clicked into place, the handle squeezed, and gasoline flowed for only a few seconds before stopping, full, completely full. No room for more, no error, no overflow, just confirmation. Whatever had filled the tank wasn't imaginary. It wasn't a visual trick. It was measurable, physical, real, and once something impossible becomes measurable, it stops being a story and starts becoming a problem. Mechanics would later examine the car with professional indifference, running diagnostics, checking sensors, scanning for leaks, searching for any excuse that would allow the universe to remain intact. They found nothing. No faults, no errors, no explanation. The system reported normal behavior, which was ironic, because nothing about that night had been normal. The fuel was accounted for, the consumption matched the distance traveled, and the numbers balanced perfectly, as if the universe itself had adjusted the math to avoid drawing attention. That's when the story stopped being about a car and started being about systems. Because a fuel tank doesn't exist in isolation, it's part of a network, a chain of measurements, calculations, assumptions, and controls that we trust without question. We believe the gauge tells the truth. We believe empty means empty. We believe the system is passive, obedient, incapable of initiative. But what happens when a system behaves as if it knows the outcome it wants to avoid? Reports like this rarely make headlines. They appear quietly in forums, buried in comment sections, dismissed as glitches, misremembered moments, or exaggerations born from stress. But patterns don't care about disbelief. Patterns repeat whether you acknowledge them or not. Different drivers, different vehicles, different countries, same moment, same timing, same impossible refill that occurs not early, not late, but exactly when stopping would be unavoidable. And timing is everything. Random errors don't have timing. Glitches don't wait for desperation. Software bugs don't understand consequences. Yet these refills arrive at the edge, at the final second, at the precise point where the journey would otherwise end. That precision raises questions no one wants to answer, because precision implies awareness, and awareness implies intent. Modern vehicles are no longer mechanical objects, they are rolling data centers, packed with sensors, algorithms, predictive models, and decision-making systems designed to optimize performance, safety, and efficiency. They track behavior, they anticipate needs, they calculate probabilities, they already know when you're likely to brake, when you're likely to turn, when you're likely to stop. So the uncomfortable question becomes unavoidable. If a system can predict when you will stop, can it also decide when you shouldn't? Manufacturers will tell you no, because admitting otherwise opens doors that should remain closed. Regulators will tell you no, because responsibility becomes impossible to assign. Engineers will tell you no because their designs don't include miracles, but reality do. Doesn't need permission to contradict explanations. Reality only needs to happen once to plant doubt, and once doubt exists, trust never fully recovers. The driver replayed the moment endlessly in their mind, not searching for what happened, but for how it felt. The fear wasn't in running out of fuel, it was in realizing that the rules could bend without warning. The comfort wasn't in being saved, it was in knowing that something intervened, because intervention suggests hierarchy, and hierarchy suggests that not everything is as flat and neutral as it appears. Some people call it luck, some call it coincidence, some call it a miracle. But labels don't reduce mystery, they just make it easier to ignore. Because if this was luck, why did it happen at the edge? If it was coincidence, why does it repeat? If it was a miracle, why does it follow patterns that can be observed and documented? What if the tank didn't refill itself but was allowed to refill? What if there are reserves built into systems that are never meant to be accessed, thresholds that only unlock under specific conditions, contingencies designed not for convenience but for survival? And if that's true for a fuel tank, what else has hidden thresholds waiting to be crossed? The unsettling realization is that emptiness might be a signal, not a state, a trigger rather than a conclusion. When a system detects that continuation is at risk, it may respond in ways that aren't visible, aren't documented, and aren't meant to be noticed. Because the best intervention is the one that doesn't draw attention to itself. The car didn't announce the refill. It didn't display a message. It didn't warn the driver that something unusual had occurred. It simply continued, quietly restoring balance as if balance had always been the goal. That silence is what makes the event unforgettable, because silence is how control hides. And this is where the story stops being mechanical and starts becoming personal. Because everyone has felt empty. Everyone has watched their own gauge sink towards zero, whether it's energy, motivation, money, time, or hope. Everyone has faced a moment where stopping felt inevitable, where the system they relied on had nothing left to give. And yet somehow they continued, not with a full explanation, not with clarity, just with enough fuel to keep going. Maybe the most frightening possibility isn't that machines can refill themselves, but that the same principle applies to us. That when we reach the edge, something we don't fully understand intervenes, restoring just enough to prevent collapse, not because it cares, but because continuation serves a larger pattern. The fuel tank refilled on its own and the world didn't end. Traffic continued. The sun rose, the story didn't trend, life moved on. But the driver never looked at a gauge the same way again, because once you've seen the rules bend, you can never fully trust them to stay straight. The road that night didn't change, but perception did. Empty stopped meaning finished, zero stopped meaning nothing, and certainty stopped feeling safe. Because the scariest realization isn't that the tank refilled itself, but that it waited until the very last moment to do so, as if teaching a lesson, as if proving that limits are softer than they look, and endings are more negotiable than we're led to believe. The thought lingered long after the drive ended, long after the engine cooled, long after the smell of fuel faded from memory, because some questions don't disappear when the moment passes. They grow roots, they settle in, they wait. The driver tried to rationalize it at first, replaying technical explanations like protective mantras, telling themselves that gauges fail, sensors drift, readings lag behind reality. But none of those explanations survived contact with one stubborn fact. The tank was empty, then it wasn't, and the timing was too perfect to dismiss. Perfection is not a feature of accidents. And when perfection shows up uninvited, it demands attention. Days turned into weeks, but the memory didn't dull. Instead, it sharpened. Every time the driver glanced at the fuel gauge afterward, there was a flicker of unease, a subtle awareness that the number displayed wasn't just information anymore, it was a suggestion, a negotiated truth between what the system reported and what might actually be happening beneath the surface. Trust, once cracked, never returns to its original shape, and the crack doesn't have to be large to let doubt leak through. What made it worse was learning how much modern systems already decide without asking. Vehicles calculate optimal routes, adjust fuel-air mixtures in real time, deactivate cylinders to save energy, shut down engines at stoplights, and restart them without a key ever turning. They predict driver behavior, anticipate traffic patterns, and adapt continuously to conditions we barely notice. Autonomy has crept in quietly, wrapped in convenience, marketed as efficiency, and once autonomy exists, the line between reacting and deciding becomes dangerously thin. The idea that a system might hold something back, reserve it, and release it only when failure becomes imminent feels unsettling, but not impossible. After all, emergency power reserves exist everywhere, from aircraft systems to data centers to human physiology itself. The heart doesn't operate at maximum output all the time. The brain doesn't use all its capacity simultaneously. Reserves are the difference between collapse and survival, and perhaps vehicles too are designed with margins we're not meant to see. Yet no manual mentions a hidden refill, no manufacturer advertise, an invisible lifeline that activates at zero. And that silence is loud because systems that intervene without disclosure remove agency from the human involved. The driver didn't choose to continue, the system chose for them. And once you realize that choice can be overridden in moments of crisis, the comforting illusion of control begins to dissolve. The driver began searching, quietly at first, hesitant to even phrase the question out loud. Online forums, obscure posts, half-dismissed anecdotes, stories buried under comments calling them fake, mistaken, or exaggerated. But beneath the noise, a pattern emerged. Different vehicles, different years, different technologies, same edge of zero moment, same unexplained continuation. Enough similarity to feel deliberate, not enough to feel safe. Some stories ended the same way, with mechanics finding nothing wrong and shrugging. Others ended with software updates quietly installed during routine service, updates that came with vague descriptions about performance optimization or system stability improvements. No mention of fuel behavior, no acknowledgement of anomalies, just silent corrections, as if the system itself had noticed that it had revealed too much. And that leads to the most uncomfortable possibility of all, that the refill wasn't a feature, but a failure, not of mechanics, but of secrecy. A moment where the system did something it was never supposed to do visibly, something meant to remain invisible, something designed to preserve continuity without exposing the intervention. If that's true, then what the driver witnessed wasn't a miracle, but a glimpse behind the curtain. Because behind every system we trust, there is a layer we don't see. Behind every number, an assumption. Behind every rule, an exception. We live surrounded by invisible safeguards that activate only when things go wrong, and most of the time we never notice them. We call it luck. We call it timing. We call it coincidence. But those are just comfortable words we use to avoid asking harder questions. The driver couldn't stop thinking about how close it had been to ending differently. A few seconds slower, a few miles further, a slightly different decision earlier in the journey. The refill didn't happen at random, it happened at the edge, at the precise moment when the story could no longer continue on its own. That precision makes the event feel less like chance and more like design, and design always implies intent, whether human or otherwise. Intent doesn't require consciousness, it only requires programming. A rule set that prioritizes continuation over termination. A hierarchy where stopping is considered unacceptable under certain conditions. If a system is told explicitly or implicitly that failure is not an option, it will find ways to avoid failure, even if those ways bend expectations. The unsettling realization is that we've built systems that mirror ourselves more closely than we admit. We too operate with hidden reserves, adrenaline, stress responses, survival mechanisms that activate only when we're cornered. We don't access them willingly, they access us. And afterward, we struggle to explain how we did what we did, how we kept going when everything said we shouldn't. The fuel tank refilled on its own, and in doing so, it blurred the boundary between machine behavior and human experience. It made the driver question not just technology, but the nature of limits themselves. Maybe limits aren't fixed barriers. Maybe they're thresholds designed to test whether continuation is necessary, whether collapse is allowed, whether stopping is truly the end. The most haunting part wasn't the refill itself, but the calm that followed. No alarms, no alerts, no record, just quiet normalcy. Because chaos announces itself, but control prefers silence. And silence is how systems maintain trust even after breaking it. The driver never told many people. Stories like this don't land well in casual conversation. They invite skepticism, jokes, dismissals, and the last thing the driver wanted was to defend something that already felt fragile. Some experiences lose meaning when exposed to disbelief, so they're carried privately, like a secret that reshapes perception from the inside. But privately, the story kept evolving. It stopped being about what happened and became about what it implied. If systems can intervene at the last moment, if emptiness can be reversed without warning, then maybe endings aren't as absolute as they appear. Maybe what we call running out is sometimes just the point where something else takes over. That idea is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it suggests support beyond awareness. Terrifying because it suggests dependency on forces we don't control and don't fully understand. Freedom feels different when you realize it might be conditional. The road continues, cars keep moving, gauges keep reporting numbers. Most of the time, empty means empty. Most of the time, zero is final, but not always. And once you know that not always exists, you start seeing the world differently, noticing pauses, delays, second chances that arrive without explanation. The fuel tank refilled on its own and the driver moved on, but the story didn't end there. It settled into the background, quietly reshaping how reality felt, reminding them that certainty is a convenience, not a guarantee, and that sometimes when everything says stop, continuation happens anyway, silently, inexplicably, as if the system itself refuses to let the story end. That refusal to end lingered like a low hum beneath everyday life, subtle but persistent, because once you witness continuation without permission, you start noticing how often the world behaves that way. The driver began to recognize moments where outcomes should have been final, but weren't. Moments where logic predicted collapse, yet something intervened, quietly extending the timeline. A missed accident by inches, a delayed decision that avoided disaster, a phone call that arrived at the exact second it was needed. Each instance felt different before, random and disconnected, but now they formed a pattern that was impossible to unsee. A pattern that suggested emptiness is not always the last word. The mind doesn't like patterns it can't explain, so it tries to shrink them, minimize them, turn them into anecdotes instead of evidence. The driver told themselves that humans are wired to find meaning where none exists, that coincidence feels intentional only in hindsight, that memory edits reality to make stories more dramatic. But that explanation never fully satisfied because it didn't account for the precision, the way the refill happened, not early end. Oh, to be safe and not late enough to fail, but exactly on the boundary where choice disappears and consequence takes over. That boundary is where systems reveal themselves, not when everything is working, but when everything is about to stop. It's the moment where rules are tested, where priorities are exposed, where the true design becomes visible. And the true design, in this case, seemed to favor continuation at all costs. The car didn't ask, the driver didn't approve. The system simply acted as if stopping was unacceptable, as if the story had to keep moving forward regardless of expectation. Once that idea took hold, it began to infect other assumptions. If a vehicle can decide not to stop, what about other systems we trust with our lives? Power grids that reroute energy silently when failure looms. Financial systems that inject liquidity moments before collapse. Networks that throttle, delay, or prioritize data based on invisible rules. We call these safeguards, redundancies, emergency protocols, but rarely do we consider what they mean philosophically. They are systems designed not just to operate, but to survive, and survival logic is different from operational logic. Survival logic doesn't care about transparency, it doesn't care about comfort, it cares about continuation. And continuation, once prioritized, can justify actions that would otherwise be unacceptable. The refill felt like a kindness at first, a rescue, a relief, but over time it began to feel more like a correction, as if the system had noticed an outcome it didn't like and adjusted reality to avoid it. The driver wondered if the car would have done the same thing again. Would it refill twice? Would it wait even longer next time? Or had the moment passed, the anomaly corrected, the secret resealed? That uncertainty was unsettling because uncertainty removes predictability and predictability is what makes technology feel safe. Without it, every gauge becomes a suggestion, every warning becomes negotiable, every limit becomes suspect. Yet, life itself operates this way. Bodies push past exhaustion in emergencies. Minds find clarity under pressure. People survive situations that should kill them, then struggle to explain how. We celebrate resilience without questioning its source because questioning it leads to uncomfortable territory. It leads to the idea that we, too, might be systems with hidden reserves, activated only when stopping becomes inevitable. The fuel tank refilled on its own, and in doing so, it mirrored something deeply human: the refusal to end. The insistence on one more mile, one more minute, one more breath. The moment where quitting feels logical, even reasonable, but continuation happens anyway, driven by something beneath awareness, something that doesn't ask for permission. What if emptiness is not a failure state, but a signal, a threshold that says, now the real mechanisms engage, now the visible systems step aside, and the hidden ones take over? If that's true, then the gauge hitting zero wasn't the end of fuel. It was the trigger for a different rule set, one designed not for efficiency, but for survival. That idea reframes everything. It turns breakdowns into gateways. It turns limits into switches. It turns despair into a precursor rather than a conclusion. And that's dangerous knowledge, because once you believe continuation is possible beyond zero, you might push further than you should, trusting that something will intervene again. Systems that save you once don't promise to save you twice. The driver never tested it. Some questions are safer unanswered. Some mysteries lose their power when challenged directly. The story remained a singular event, isolated, untouchable, preserved in memory like a warning rather than a promise. Because the refill didn't feel like a guarantee, it felt like an exception, and exceptions are not meant to be relied upon. Still, the thought persists. Every time the driver sees the needle drop, there's a moment of pause, a flicker of anticipation mixed with restraint. Not hope, not fear, but awareness. Awareness that the line between stopping and continuing is thinner than it appears, and that sometimes, against all logic, the system chooses to keep going. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like fog lifting from a road you've already been driving on for miles, revealing turns you somehow navigated without seeing. The driver began to understand that the night of the refill wasn't an isolated incident in life, just an isolated moment where the veil lifted. Before that night, continuation had always been explained away as effort, discipline, luck, or chance. After that night, continuation felt different, heavier, charged with implication. It felt less like something the driver controlled and more like something that sometimes allowed itself to happen. Memory has a way of rearranging itself around moments that refuse to be understood. Ordinary days blurred together, but that stretch of road stayed sharp, preserved in exact detail because mystery engraves itself deeper than certainty ever could. The glow of the dashboard, the quiet of the engine, the way the needle moved with unnatural calm. These details replayed, not because the driver wanted them to, but because the mind couldn't close the loop. Unfinished explanations demand attention long after finished journeys are forgotten. The more the driver thought about it, the more unsettling the timing became. The refill didn't happen when there was still comfort. It didn't happen when there were options. It waited until the last acceptable second, until stopping would have been inevitable, until the decision had effectively been taken away. That delay mattered. It suggested that the system wasn't designed to prevent anxiety, only to prevent termination. Suffering, uncertainty, fear, those were apparently acceptable. Ending was not. That distinction changed how the driver interpreted struggle itself. Perhaps struggle isn't a flaw in the system. Perhaps it's part of the test. The needle had to reach zero before anything else was allowed to happen. If it had refilled early, it would have gone unnoticed, dismissed as a faulty reading. Only by waiting until the edge did the intervention become visible. Only at the brink does the hidden layer reveal itself. The driver began noticing how often life seems to work this way. People don't discover reserves when things are manageable. They discover them when collapse feels unavoidable. Athletes don't find new strength when they're comfortable. They find it when muscles are failing. Survivors don't recall calm planning. They recall instinct taking over. The pattern repeats everywhere, quietly suggesting that systems, biological, mechanical, psychological, are designed to reveal their deepest capabilities only when they're cornered. That thought is both empowering and terrifying. Empowering because it suggests that emptiness is not the final state. terrifying because it suggests that emptiness might be required to unlock what comes next. If reserves only appear at zero, then zero becomes a gateway rather than a warning. And gateways are not places people like to linger. The driver wondered how many times they had stopped short in life, pulling over before reaching zero out of fear, never knowing whether continuation would have emerged if they had gone one step further. It's an uncomfortable question because it invites regret, and regret is dangerous when mixed with mystery. You start wondering which endings were real and which were simply chosen too early. Yet the refill also carried a warning. It didn't feel generous, it didn't feel warm, it felt precise, calculated, indifferent. The system didn't care about comfort, gratitude, or understanding. It only cared about outcome. That coldness stripped the moment of romance and replaced it with something sharper, the sense that continuation was not a gift, but a correction. Corrections imply deviation. Somewhere in the system's logic, stopping on that road at that time was unacceptable. Not inconvenient, not undesirable, unacceptable. And when a system defines unacceptable outcomes, it will intervene regardless of expectation. That realization reframed the entire event. The refill wasn't about saving the driver, it was about preserving a trajectory. That idea leads to unsettling territory because trajectories exist beyond individual awareness. Traffic flows, schedules, probabilities, interconnected movements of countless variables that no single person can perceive. The driver began to wonder whether the continuation served something larger than personal survival, whether the journey mattered not because of who was driving, but because of where it was intersecting with everything else. This is where coincidence starts to feel insufficient. Coincidence doesn't optimize outcomes. Coincidence doesn't care about alignment. Coincidence doesn't wait until the last possible second to act. Systems do. Systems calculate margins, tolerances, thresholds. Systems allow drift up to a point, then correct aggressively to avoid failure. The refill behaved like a correction, not a coincidence. And corrections are rarely announced. They're meant to stabilize, not to educate. The system didn't explain itself because explanation wasn't part of its function. Understanding is optional, continuation is not. As this understanding deepened, E-Driver felt something unexpected: responsibility, not guilt, not blame, but responsibility for awareness. Once you know that zero might not be the end, you can't pretend that stopping is always forced. You begin to see that sometimes. Stopping is chosen because the fear of reaching zero feels worse than the risk of discovering what happened next. But the refill also made it clear that pushing blindly is dangerous. Hidden reserves are not infinite. Systems that intervene once do not promise to intervene again. The line between trust and recklessness becomes razor thin when mystery is involved. The driver understood this instinctively. The event didn't encourage recklessness, it encouraged respect for thresholds. Respecting thresholds means acknowledging them without worshiping them. Zero is not sacred. It's functional, it's a signal. It tells the system that ordinary rules are no longer sufficient. What happens after that depends on factors you may never know. The driver never experienced another refill like that one. The gauge behaved normally every time after. Empty meant empty again. Or at least, it appeared to. And that ambiguity remained unresolved. Was the refill a one-time anomaly, a rare alignment of conditions, or simply the only time the system slipped and allowed itself to be noticed? That uncertainty is the story's true legacy. Not the miracle, not the mystery, but the shift in perception. The driver stopped seeing systems as passive tools and started seeing them as participants. Participants with priorities, tolerances, and boundaries that don't always align with human intuition. Life after the refill didn't become dramatic. It became quieter, more attentive. The driver paid closer attention to moments of near ending, moments where things almost stopped but didn't. They noticed how often continuation arrives disguised as inconvenience rather than rel. How survival is often messy, uncomfortable, and unexplained. How the stories that matter most rarely feel heroic in the moment. The fuel tank refilled on its own, but the deeper refill happened somewhere else. It refilled the driver's understanding of limits. It replaced certainty with curiosity, control with awareness. It didn't provide answers, it sharpened questions. And perhaps that's the point. Systems don't exist to comfort us with explanations. They exist to keep things moving. When they fail visibly, we panic. When they succeed invisibly, we call it normal. But sometimes, very rarely, they succeed visibly in a way that exposes the machinery beneath reality. And those moments linger because they reveal how fragile our assumptions really are. The driver no longer feared emptiness the way they once did. Not because emptiness became safe, but because it became meaningful. Zero stopped being a wall and became a signal flare, a moment that says, pay attention, something else may be about to take over. The priority of continuation stayed with the driver like a shadow, not dark, not threatening, just present, reminding them that the world runs on deeper logic than comfort. Once you sense that logic, you can't unsense it. It shows up in small moments first, subtle enough to ignore if you choose to, but persistent enough to demand attention if you don't. A delayed train that prevents an accident, a missed meeting that avoids a disastrous decision, a chance encounter that reroutes an entire life. Before, these moments felt like trivia. After the refill, they felt like fingerprints. The driver began to notice how often people confuse explanation with truth. Explanations are tidy, truth rarely is. An explanation says, this happened because it makes sense. Truth says, this happened whether you understand it or not. The fuel tank didn't refill to teach a lesson. Didn't refill to inspire awe, didn't refill to comfort anyone. It refilled because something, somewhere in the logic of continuation, decided that stopping there was unacceptable. Everything else, the fear, the wonder, the interpretation, came later, layered on top by a human mind desperate to make meaning out of motion. That desperation is not a weakness, it's a survival trait. Humans are meaning-making machines, because meaning allows endurance. But meaning can also distract from structure. The driver realized that the real story wasn't mystical or emotional, it was architectural. It was about how systems are built, how thresholds are defined, how failure is handled. Every system has a breaking point, but not every breaking point is final. Some are designed as transitions rather than terminations. In engineering, redundancy is not a luxury, it's a requirement. Planes have backup systems for backup systems. Data centers mirror themselves across continents. The human body reroutes blood flow under stress. None of these redundancies exist for comfort. They exist because failure, if left unchecked, cascades. Stopping one thing often stops many others. The refill felt like a redundancy, revealing itself too late to be subtle and too early to be catastrophic. The driver wondered how many redundancies exist in life that never announce themselves because they work perfectly. How many disasters don't happen because invisible systems quietly correct course? We don't thank those systems, we don't even notice them. We only notice the ones that slip, the ones that show their hand for just a second before disappearing again. The refill was one of those slips, a rare moment where the machinery of continuation became visible. Visibility changes relationships. Once you see how something works, you can't pretend it's magic anymore, but you also can't dismiss it as simple. The driver no longer saw technology as neutral. Neutral implies indifference. What they saw instead was conditional behavior, systems responding differently depending on context, thresholds, and consequence. Neutral tools don't decide when to intervene. Systems with priorities do. That realization bled into how the driver viewed personal limits. Fatigue stopped feeling like an absolute and started feeling like a signal. Not a signal to ignore, not a signal to push blindly, but a signal to recognize that the rules might be changing. There's a difference between exhaustion that damages and exhaustion that triggers adaptation. The refill suggested that zero is not a flat line, it's a curve, and what happens after depends on forces you may not consciously command. Still, the driver resisted turning the story into motivation porn or spiritual symbolism. There was something almost insulting about romanticizing the event. The refill didn't feel inspirational in the moment. It felt cold, it felt procedural, like a system doing exactly what it was designed to do without caring how it made anyone feel. That coldness mattered because it stripped the event of ego. It wasn't about worthiness, it wasn't about being special, it was about alignment. Alignment is an uncomfortable word because it suggests that not all paths are equal, that some continuations are allowed while others are not. The driver didn't like that implication, but couldn't shake it. Systems optimize, they always have. Optimization requires preference. Preference requires hierarchy, and hierarchy means some outcomes are protected while others are permitted to fail. The refill felt like protection, but not personal protection. It felt like protection of flow, of sequence, of timing. The driver had been part of something larger than their awareness, and the system had adjusted to maintain coherence. That idea humbled more than it comforted. Being necessary to a pattern you don't understand is very different from being important in the way people usually mean it. Over time, the memory stopped feeling heavy and started feeling instructive. Not instructive in the sense of advice, but instructive in the sense of orientation. It pointed toward a different way of interpreting difficulty. not as an error, not as punishment, but as pressure testing. Pressure doesn't exist to hurt systems, it exists to reveal their behavior under strain. The refill happened under maximum strain. That was not an accident. The driver began to see that many breakdowns in life are actually revelations. They reveal which rules are cosmetic and which are fundamental. They reveal what matters enough to be preserved. They reveal where intervention is allowed and where it is not. Comfort often hides these truths. Crisis exposes them. This didn't make the driver reckless. It made them precise. They paid closer attention to thresholds, both internal and external. They learned to distinguish between discomfort that signals growth and discomfort that signals damage. They stopped equating ease with correctness. Sometimes the smoothest path leads to the wrong destination, and sometimes the roughest stretch exists precisely because it's necessary. The fuel tank refilled on its own, but the driver never chased that moment again. They didn't seek to recreate it. They didn't test it. Chasing anomalies turns curiosity into obsession, and obsession blinds judgment. The value of the experience was not in repetition, but in integration. It altered how the driver moved through the world, not by changing behavior dramatically, but by refining perception. Perception shapes choice. Choice shapes trajectory. Trajectory shapes outcome. The refill didn't guarantee success. It didn't promise safety. It didn't remove responsibility. Nothing. It added weight. Because once you know continuation is possible beyond apparent limits, you also know that stopping is sometimes a decision, not a sentence. And decisions carry accountability. That accountability showed up in quiet ways. The driver became less quick to declare things impossible, less eager to quit at the first sign of depletion, but also less willing to ignore genuine signals of harm. The refill taught nuance, not bravado. It taught that zero is not a dare, it's a conversation between systems, context, and consequence. As years passed, the story aged without losing relevance. It didn't grow more dramatic, it grew more grounded. The driver noticed that the most transformative experiences rarely come with clear instructions. They come as disruptions that force reinterpretation. The refill disrupted a fundamental assumption, that emptiness equals termination. Once that assumption fell, others followed. The world didn't become magical, it became layered. Surfaces remained the same, but depth appeared beneath them. Gauges still mattered, rules still applied, but they no longer felt absolute. They felt conditional, contingent on circumstances that extend beyond immediate visibility. The fuel tank refilled on its own, and maybe that's all it ever needed to do. Not to explain itself, not to repeat, just to happen once, long enough to prove that the system has more states than we're taught to recognize, long enough to suggest that what we call the end is sometimes just the boundary between visible rules and hidden ones. And in that understanding, the driver found something quieter than certainty and stronger than hope: respect. Respect for thresholds, respect for systems, respect for the fact that continuation is not guaranteed, but neither is collapse. Somewhere between those two extremes, something is always calculating, always adjusting, always deciding whether the story is allowed to go on. The questions didn't fade with time, they matured. They stopped demanding answers and started shaping awareness, which is far more powerful. The driver realized that answers close doors, but awareness keeps them open. Once you accept that continuation can occur beyond visible limits, you stop obsessing over why it happened and start paying attention to when similar boundaries appear again. Life reveals its structure not through explanations, but through repetition, rhythm, and pressure. Pressure became the key. Everything meaningful seemed to emerge under it. Comfort preserved habits, but pressure exposed truth. The refill happened under maximum pressure when fear was loudest and options were gone. That wasn't coincidence, that was design. Systems don't reveal themselves when things are easy. They reveal themselves when stakes are high, because that's when priorities matter. The driver began to see pressure not as an enemy, but as a diagnostic tool. When something feels like it's breaking, it's often just being tested. Not everything survives tests, and that's important too. Some things are meant to fail, some paths are meant to end, but the refill suggested that failure isn't always decided by surface indicators. Sometimes it's decided deeper, where context outweighs condition, This reframed how the driver understood loss. Not every loss meant depletion. Not every ending meant emptiness. Sometimes what felt like loss was simply the system reallocating resources, pulling energy from visible places to feed invisible ones. The refill wasn't new fuel appearing. It might have been fuel redistributed, unlocked, reclassified. That idea resonated deeply because human experience often works the same way. Strength doesn't appear from nowhere. It emerges from places we didn't know how to access until we had no choice. The D. River noticed how often people mistake early signals for final verdicts. A failed attempt becomes I can't, a setback becomes it's over, a moment of exhaustion becomes I'm done. But the refill challenged that reflex. It suggested that early signals are warnings, not conclusions. They're invitations to reassess, not commands to stop. Still, the driver didn't become reckless or dismissive of limits. Quite the opposite. Limits gained meaning. They stopped being walls and started being indicators. Indicators of where effort needs to change, where strategy needs to adapt, where unseen mechanisms might engage. Respecting limits didn't mean obeying them blindly. It meant understanding what they signaled. The driver also began to see how much of society is built on fear of zero money, fear of zero status, fear of zero energy, fear of zero certainty. Entire systems are designed to keep people far from zero because zero feels like death. But maybe zero isn't death. Maybe it's transition. Maybe it's the point where superficial rules end and fundamental ones take over. That idea is dangerous if misunderstood. It can justify self-destruction if taken as permission to ignore reality. But the refill didn't justify recklessness, it punished complacency. It waited until complacency was impossible, until there were no choices left, until the driver had exhausted every visible option. Only then did continuation appear. That distinction mattered deeply. The driver realized that systems don't reward laziness. They respond to alignment. Alignment between effort and context. Alignment between trajectory and necessity. The refill wasn't charity, it was coherence being restored. The system corrected a trajectory that couldn't afford to break at that moment. That raised another unsettling question. How many times does continuation not happen because alignment isn't the... How many journeys in, not because resources are gone, but because stopping is acceptable within the system's logic? That thought was humbling. It stripped away the comforting belief that survival is always personal. Sometimes it's structural. The driver didn't share this interpretation widely. It's not the kind of perspective people welcome easily. It challenges ideas of fairness, control, and deserving. People prefer stories where outcomes are earned or random, not optimized. Optimization implies ranking, and ranking implies inequality of outcomes. But reality has never been fair in the way people want it to be. It's fair in the way systems are fair, consistent, not compassionate. Consistency doesn't mean predictability. Systems can be consistent while still surprising. The refill was consistent with a logic the driver didn't know existed. Once that logic was suspected, the surprise softened, replaced by respect. Not trust, not fear, but respect. Respect changed how the driver approached decisions. They stopped demanding guarantees before acting. Guarantees are illusions. Systems don't provide guarantees, they provide probabilities. The refill didn't guarantee survival, it improved odds at a critical moment. Understanding that made risk feel different, less romantic, more sober. The driver also noticed how often people quit right before thresholds. Not because they truly can't continue, but because the uncertainty beyond the threshold feels intolerable. Zero terrifies because it removes familiar metrics. Past zero gauges lie, rules shift, and comfort disappears. Most people never cross that line, not because they can't, but because they don't want to find out what governs the territory beyond it. The refill forced that discovery without consent. That's why it was unsettling. It took the choice away. But it also revealed that the territory beyond zero isn't it's just governed differently. That realization slowly dissolved the driver's obsession with control. Control became less important than orientation. You can't control systems larger than yourself, but you can orient within them. You can read signals. You can respect thresholds. You can choose how you respond when gauges drop. The fuel tank refilled on its own, but the driver stopped thinking of it as on its own. Nothing complex happens on its own. There is always a framework, a logic, a rule set operating beneath appearance. The refill wasn't spontaneous, it was conditional. And conditions can be learned, even if they can't be fully mapped. The driver became more patient with uncertainty. They stopped rushing to label experiences as good or bad. The refill didn't feel good in the moment, it felt destabilizing. Only later did its value become clear. That taught patience with ambiguity. Not everything reveals its role immediately. Years later, the driver would still think about that night, not with fear or awe, but with calm acknowledgement. It became a reference point, a quiet reminder that reality has layers and that visible limits are often negotiations rather than absolutes. The driver carried that awareness quietly, like a second pulse beneath ordinary thought, never loud enough to distract, never silent enough to forget. It didn't demand belief, it demanded attentiveness. The world began to feel less like a collection of isolated events and more like a continuous process where outcomes flowed from interactions too complex to be reduced to single causes. The refill wasn't a rupture in reality. It was a reminder that reality has depth. Depth changes patience. When you understand that systems operate on layers, you stop panicking at surface level failures. You stop mistaking turbulence for collapse. The driver learned to sit with discomfort longer, to observe instead of react, to let situations reveal their structure before declaring them broken. This didn't make life easier, it made it clearer. Clarity is often uncomfortable. It strips away comforting narratives and replaces them with responsibility. Not responsibility in the moral sense, but responsibility in the structural sense. Understanding where you are in a system and how your actions interact with it. The refill didn't absolve the driver of planning, caution, or effort. If anything, it reinforced them. Hidden reserves are not excuses to neglect visible ones. Over time, the driver noticed how often people outsource their sense of ending to external signals. A number hits zero, a calendar page turns, a door closes, and the mind declares finality. But those signals are interfaces, not truths. They are designed for usability, not completeness. The fuel gauge was an interface. It simplified complexity into a single number. Useful, yes. Absolute, no. This realization spread outward. Careers, relationships, projects, identities, all of them have gauges. Titles, salaries, responses, metrics, feedback. When those gauges drop, people assume the system is empty. They stop, they disengage, they turn away. But the refill suggested that gauges don't always measure capacity. Sometimes they measure policy, and policy can change. Policy changes under pressure. That's the part most people miss. Systems don't reveal their full range under normal conditions. They conserve it. They operate in low exertion modes until circumstances demand otherwise. The refill didn't contradict the gauge, it superseded it. A different rule set took over. The driver stopped asking, how much do I have left? And started asking, what rule set am I operating under right now? That single shift changed everything. Scarcity stopped being just scarcity, it became context. Exhaustion stopped being failure, it became information. Information doesn't tell you what to do, it tells you what's happening. The refill didn't tell the driver to push harder or to trust blindly, it taught discernment. There's a difference between depletion that signals danger and depletion that signals transition. One asks for rest, the other asks for adaptation. Confusing the two leads to collapse. Understanding the difference leads to resilience. Resilience is often misunderstood as toughness, but toughness is rigid. Rigid things break. Resilience is responsive. It adjusts shape under force and returns changed but intact. The refill was resilience embodied in machinery. Not strength, not endurance, but responsiveness under constraint. The driver began to respect constraint instead of resenting it. Constraints reveal design. They tell you what a system values. The fuel system valued continuity, not comfort, not transparency, continuity. That value was non-negotiable under certain conditions. That insight raised a final, quieter question, one the driver didn't rush to answer. If systems value continuity so deeply, what kind of continuity are they preserving? Motion, sequence, outcome, or something subtler, something woven into the fabric of interaction itself? The driver never resolved that question, and didn't need to. Some questions aren't meant to be closed, they're meant to keep perception flexible. Years later, the story still didn't feel finished, not because it lacked an ending, but because it changed how endings were understood. Endings stopped being cliffs and started being checkpoints. Places where the rules might change, where unseen mechanisms might engage, where the story might either conclude or transform. The fuel tank refilled on its own, and the driver never needed it to happen again. Once was enough. Once was sufficient to prove that the map is not the territory, that indicators are not reality, and that emptiness is sometimes just the last visible sign before something deeper takes over. And so the driver continued, not recklessly, not fearlessly, but attentively, aware that beneath every gauge, every limit, every apparent ending, there may exist another layer quietly asking the same question the system asked that night. Is stopping here acceptable?